Now this game was played in the 2009 Amateur East Team Tournament, so that's about like 7 years ago. My opponent was rated around 1800, and I was only around 1650. So this guy is actually one of the best juniors in the nation right now. His rating's like 2400, and he's made a lot of progress very quickly. He gained 500 rating in 1 year, which is really, really good. But in this game, I think a clear problem was my lack of confidence. I was a lower rated player, and I kind of let his rating intimidate me. I missed a lot of chances, and I think I could have used those chances to actually create a better position for myself, or to save a draw at the end. So without further ado, let's take a look at this game. I started out with a move e4, and my opponent countered with the Sicilian, c5. So after c5, I played the move knight f3, and after knight c6 and d4, we have what's called the open Sicilian. So after d4, we have open Sicilian, but there's other lines like such as knight f3, which is the closed Sicilian, also known with g3, and I can still transpose it as c3 Sicilian with moves such as c3. But in this game, I chose the move d4, going for the open Sicilian. And my opponent captured on d4, I recaptured, and he played the move g6. So after the move g6, we see that this position is actually in the accelerated dragon. The dragon structure is defined when black plays the move g6, and it's accelerated because he played the move g6 before he played the move d6. So this makes some sense because he wants to play the move d5 later on in the future in one step, instead of playing d6 and then d5. But let's see how I responded to the move g6. So I continue with my moves knight c3. After knight c3, it's okay. But in the accelerated dragon, another very popular line is to play the move c4. Now this line is kind of like the Maroczy bind. And after the moves, for example, knight f6, knight c3, white's idea is actually he uses both pawns to control the square on d5, making it much harder for black to ever advance his pawn there. Now, what I played, knight c3, is also another line, but c4 is more popular and has a better win percentage. So after knight to c3, black played bishop to g7, putting pressure on my knight on d4, so I counter with bishop to e3, developing another piece and protecting my knight on d4. So now it's black's turn. Black played the move knight to f6. So knight to f6, the idea is that black wants to castle kingside. So after knight f6, I play the move bishop to c4. So the idea is that we get our bishop out, we control the d5 square, so it stops d5, and we can get ready to either castle kingside or queenside. A lot of times, though, the dragon is known for its sharpness. So since we know that black is probably going to castle kingside, it's a better idea for white to castle kingside so that he can later on go with the pawn storm on the kingside. See, if white castles his king on this side, he can't really play the moves g4 and h4 because that would weaken his own king. However, if his king is safely tucked on this side, then of course he can move his pawns, the g pawn and the h pawn, towards black's king without any fear. So after bishop to c4, black decided to castle, and I continued developing because I played the move queen to d2. The idea here is that this g7 bishop is a very strong piece in defending black's king. On g7, it controls all the dark squares that were created when the pawn moved to g6. So if white can somehow trade off this pawn or this bishop on g7, maybe with bishop to h6, then that would be a great success. So the idea is after queen to d2, I'm going to support the bishop onto h6 later on to trade off this dark square bishop on g7. So after queen to d2, black played the move d6. Now here, black actually had another resource. He could have played the move knight to g4. Knight to g4 attacks the white's bishop and also controls h6. So the idea here is that black is trying to trade off his knight for my bishop, and if he does, then I have no other chance of removing his bishop on g7. So this was a good opportunity for him to dull my attack, though he didn't take it. Instead he played d6, and I quickly go f3 to stop knight g4 now. My opponent responded with bishop to d7, and once again, even before I start castling, I already go h4. The idea is that I'm going to play h5 later on, starting my attack. Now a quick note, I can play h5 here. Why? Because after, let's say he plays the move rook to c8, this seems like a pawn sacrifice, but in reality it actually opens up my own h-file. So if I sacrifice here, knight takes h5, I can later on play something like g4, and after the knight moves back, then I can use my rook to attack on the h-file, especially on the h7 square. However, my opponent prevents any future ideas of playing the move h5 by playing his own h5 move. This doesn't exactly weaken his king because I can't really get past this pawn unless I play the move g4, which will only happen in the very distant future. So here, instead, I just played the move queenside castling, and my opponent played the move rook to c8. So we're just both continuing to develop our pieces. I don't like how his rook's attacking my bishop, so I move my bishop back to b3. And my opponent played the move knight to e5. So my opponent played knight to e5 to play later on knight to c4. The idea is it forks my queen and bishop, so I'm forced to give up my light square bishop. So after knight to e5, then I play the move bishop to h6. I want to trade off this bishop as quick as possible, and that weakens the dark squares on black's king side. Black plays the move bishop or pawn to b5 here, which is a very interesting idea. So after pawn to b5, I first finish capturing the bishop that I wanted to capture on g7, and now I'm faced with a choice. Should I take the pawn on b5? Now b5, no doubt, is a very aggressive move. It sacrifices the pawn because I have two attackers on b5, while he only has one defender. So in theory, I could take on b5 with my knight. Knight takes b5. But I was a little bit afraid here. First of all, I was afraid that he would somehow get some attack with this new open b file, which kind of doesn't really exist. There's really no way that black can exactly get an attack right now with this b file. Even if he plays the move queen to b6, I can just come back to d4, and my bishop is still a very good defender here. If he plays something like a5 to try to lure my bishop away, I really don't even need to worry. There's nothing attacking me on b2. His queen might be putting pressure later on, but my king protects it, and I'm not super worried about any attack right now. So this position is really fine for me, and I didn't need to worry about that. In addition, I shouldn't really be worried about any other ideas. For example, if he takes me, I can just recapture back, and now black doesn't really have enough pieces on the queen side to attack me with. He only has a rook lined up here, and his knight can sort of help with maybe knight c4 later on. So this is not really much for me to fear, and I really should have taken the pawn, which would leave me up a pawn. Instead, I was a little bit afraid of what my opponent could have done. I decided to play the move a3 here. So after a3, the idea was that I would stop his pawn from coming to b4, and maybe later, if I could take, I'll re-evaluate. But now after a3, he played knight to c4, attacking my queen, and I didn't really get the chance to take his pawn because after I recaptured his knight, his pawn moved away. And now I was really a little bit scared of his attack for, once again, not really a good reason. I was somehow afraid that he would attack my pawn on b2, maybe with queen b6 and rook to b8, creating a battery. But that's still really far away, and I don't really need to worry about that just yet. I was thinking that I want to put my queen on c3, to guard the b2 square, in order to stop any of these kind of threats later on. So here I actually became really passive and played the move knight to b1. So this is really not a good move because putting my knight on b1 is actually undeveloping it. I spent a move coming here and I spent a move coming back. And really, it doesn't have that many good squares to go to in the future. Maybe I can go to d2, but once again, that requires another move, and that's just really, really slow. So knight to b1 isn't really a good idea. Instead, maybe I could try something like g4. If I start my own attack, maybe my opponent won't have that much time to start his own attack. So if he takes me, this seems like a pawn sacrifice, right? He has two defenders, and I only have one attacker on this pawn. But I can play the move h5 here. So after h5, if he plays the move taking, then I can actually directly sacrifice my rook. And if he captures here, check, king h7, check, king g7, check again. Now this h file is open, and my rook can swoop in with checkmate. So since I can start my own attack, I don't need to worry about my opponent's attack. However, knight b1 was played in the game because I was a little bit scared of his attack, thinking about how he was such a good player. So don't let your opponent's rating distract you, right? I thought he would have a really good attack up his sleeve since he was rated so high. But really, you can see that really what he did was a bluff, and I could have won a pawn and not played so passively. So after knight to b1, he played rook to b8, lining up his pieces against my b2 pawn. I play queen to c3, guarding my b2 pawn, and now after queen to c7, he guards his own c4 pawn. So he has nice lines against my king, while I don't really have any attack against his. Now I play the move knight to d2, reactivating my knight, and if rook to c8, protecting the pawn on c4, I play the move f4, trying to start some sort of attack, maybe with e5 later on. So after he plays the move queen to b7 to line up both pieces on the b file, once again we can realize that he doesn't really have an attack. I mean, sure, he has pieces lined up against me, but I can still use my pieces over here to attack his king. My queen here is doing a pretty good job of holding down the fort, so I'm not really that worried. I play the move rook h to f1, preparing the move f5. My opponent moves his king away from the diagonal here, because he didn't like how my queen was attacking or putting pressure on it, and he's preparing to take on e4 now. So after king to g8, I play the move rook e to d1, protecting the e4 knight, or e4 pawn. However, if I don't do that, I can actually play f5 immediately. I need to be a little bit more daring here, because then I can open up some lines against the opponent's king. Now, if he tries to take on e4, then I can capture back, and if his queen captures back, I can simply play the move g3. Even though my opponent seems to be up a pawn here, I have successfully created lines against him on the king's side, and because of that, I should have some sort of edge here to attack with. So instead of sacrificing the pawn for the initiative, I decide to continue playing passively and defend the pawn on e4. My opponent played bishop to g4 to get his bishop to a better diagonal, I guess, and now I play the move f5 to open up some lines. My opponent played the move knight to d7 in order to bring his knight to a better square, perhaps, later on with c5 or e5. And now I realize that after trading pawns on g6, I don't really gain that much. Sure, I have succeeded in opening up the f-file, but that's not really essential in my attack. There's not really much I can do here, and really this position isn't that great for white. So if white plays the move knight takes c4 here, we do win a pawn. However, the problem is we actually lose the b-file even more. So before, the c4 pawn was very good at blocking the rook's attack, but now after we take it, we're getting attacked instead. So after knight to e5, for example, we're already getting threatened on c4, and if we play the move b3, then he can already open up the b-file here. We don't want our b-file open, so it's best to not capture this pawn. But my move here wasn't exactly correct either. I played the move b3. So b3 really wasn't the correct move. You don't want to open up your king side when the opponent's attacking you there. So my king is on this side right now. You don't want to open up this side because he's attacking you immediately. Even though this doesn't lose material just yet with c takes b3, it turns out that black could have played the move e5. And after my knight would move, for example, knight to f3, then he'll be able to take here. And if I want to recapture here, he will eventually be able to win a knight because this c2 pawn is pinned. So essentially, e5 was a removal of the guard because the knight here was protecting the b3 square, and now after it moves, it's no longer protecting it. Instead, my opponent didn't see this. He just took on b3, and after a bunch of trades, knight four takes b3, knight c5, and king b2. I don't really want to put myself in a pin. This is not really a good idea. Instead, I could have just played rook to e3, supporting all my pieces together. But after king b2, see, after a5, we have kind of a problem now because he's threatening to move a4. So once again, I need to spend another move wasting playing my king on a1. So after more exchanges, rook to c2, finally my opponent finds a way to win some material. Rook to c2 attacks the knight, and if the knight moves, then obviously I will lose the pawn on b3. But I realized that even after rook to f2, I still lose a pawn on b3 because the knight's now pinned to the rook. So after the rook takes on b3, the knight takes on b3. Black can play rook takes f2. Now after rook takes f2, white takes on a5. So my question here is, how would you evaluate the position? Is white better or is black better? So we'll stop part 1 for this right now, and you can see the answer in the beginning of part 2.